Hi, this is Bob Wells here, and welcome to Undercurrent Stories. This is the show where we hear about people's interests and uncover some fascinating stories at the same time. I hope you enjoy today's show. Today on the show, I am delighted to welcome best-selling author Tony Riches. A specialist in the history of the early Tudors, Tony is best known for his Tudor Trilogy. His other international bestsellers include Mary, Tudor Princess, Brandon, Tudor Knight, and his latest book, Katherine, Tudor Duchess. Hi, Tony, and welcome to the show.
Hi.
Before we talk about your best-selling books and the Tudor period, can you tell us what led you to becoming an author, please? What did you do before?
I had various careers. I had a career as a director of the NHS in Wales, and I ran my own consultancy business. And my last full-time work was as director of planning in Cardiff Council. And I'd always wanted to write, and I started sort of trying different ideas out. But I was born in Pembroke, which is where Henry Tudor was born. And I realised when I started looking into Henry Tudor in a bit more detail that you could be forgiven for visiting Pembroke and not even knowing that he was born there. And also that when I was at school, and this might resonate with you, that we started with Henry VIII as if there was nothing much really before him, and then did his 6 wives, and then we moved on to the Civil War, I think. We kind of skipped past everything before Henry VIII in terms of the Tudors, and we probably skipped over Elizabeth I. I hardly remember much about it. We might have done a little bit on it. And so I started gathering together material for a book about Henry VII, and I realised that I had enough for at least 3 books. And I suddenly had, there's flash of inspiration where I realised that he could be born in the first book, come of age in the second book, and become king in the third book. So it just naturally lent itself to a trilogy. And that's how I really got started successfully writing. And I'm pleased to say that I was able to retire 10 years earlier than planned and become a full-time author then. So I now write a book a year. And, I'm very much enjoying that as a way of making a living now.
Yeah, it must be nice to have an interest or a passion such as writing and combine it with a job as well. Yeah,
and some of the fascinating things are, obviously I've got the time and the space to actually go and visit all the locations. So my wife and I went to the remote chateau in Brittany where Henry Tudor lived in exile, and actually stood in the room where he lived and got a real sense of the place. 500 years just evaporated, and not many people have done that, of course. But when you then come to write about it, it's grounded in fact and reality in a way that it might not have been otherwise. And even in my last book about Catherine Willoughby, I hardly knew anything about Catherine Willoughby, and I didn't realise that she knew every one of Henry VIII's 6 wives. And we visited Grimsthorpe Castle and actually stood in the room where she spent her last years. And that was amazing to feel so close to her after having kind of lived with her for a few years.
I bet. Yeah, Grimsthorpe Castle's about 10 miles from where I live. I mentioned earlier about Burley. So
that's right. Well, the team there were fantastic. They were so helpful, and that was a really good example about the value of personally visiting the locations in books, because you get a sense of the geography of the area then, don't you? And we went to the chapel at Spilsby, the Willoughby Chapel, where her tomb is.
Yeah.
And we had the chapel to ourselves. So I wondered originally whether I'd be able to take photographs. we had the run of the place, so
Wow.
that was amazing.
I bet it was. So obviously you're an expert on the Tudor period, and I know for this show we've got a limited time, but would you be able just to give the listeners a sort of feel for what the Tudor period was? You mentioned earlier about Henry VIII, and I must admit, when I was at school, I learnt about Henry VIII and a little bit about Elizabeth I, but that was it. Are you able to sort of give people almost like a summary of what the Tudor period was all about, please, Tony?
Yeah, very much so. The story is almost too incredible to be true, because there's a young Welshman, Owen Tudor, who becomes a servant to the lonely Queen Catherine of Valois, who's the widow of Henry V. And they're in Windsor Castle. And basically, it suits the government to keep the Dowager Queen out of the way. And they're trying to think who they might marry her off to. And Owen falls in love with her, and they run off and get married in secret. And it's a Welsh bishop, Bishop Morgan, that marries them. And then they have several children, but the main two are their sons, Jasper Tudor and Edmund Tudor. And Edmund's tomb is not very far from where I live now, in St David's Cathedral. And he married the 14-year-old Margaret Beaufort, who was one of the wealthiest heiresses in the country. And they had a child who was Henry Tudor. And then this all happens at the same time as the Wars of the Roses. So the Yorkists managed to put an end to Henry Tudor, to Edmund Tudor in Carmarthen Castle. And Henry then lives with his uncle Jasper in Pembroke Castle, which is close to where I was born, which is where my interest in it comes from. And eventually the Yorkists reached West Wales, and the only choice that Henry Tudor has is to flee the country with his uncle Jasper. And they go to Brittany from Tenby. They go through tunnels under the streets to the harbour. And
tunnels?
Yeah, there are actual tunnels under the streets. And my wife and I have actually explored these tunnels. Some people think it's a myth.
They're still open?
They're still there, yeah. There's
wow.
Tenby's a seaside town, and there's a Boots the Chemist's there, which is in the basement of Boots the Chemist is the entrance to the tunnel which leads to the harbour. And,
and is that something that obviously you need special permission, or is it open all the time? Or?
Yeah, the manager no, it's not open all the time. No. The manager of the chemists at the time allowed us. There was like a big sheet of white hardboard blocking the entrance, and she just pulled it to one side and had a torch, and you could just see this tunnel hewn through the rock. And we started walking down it, and there was a Tudor fireplace which still had intact Tudor wine bottles in it. And the only reason that would be down there is if people were hiding down there for some time, hiding from the Yorkists. Anyway, cut a long story short, the most implausible bit is that Henry would manage to raise a mercenary army and return back to Pembrokeshire and march through Wales to Bosworth Field and challenge the King of England, who of course was Richard III. And Yorkists would say he was lucky, but his timing was perfect because the country was in the mood for a change, and everybody knows what happened was that Richard III was not supported as well as he might have been by the noble families, and we ended up with Henry as king. Now, nobody was more surprised than Henry, I think, because he'd not really been prepared to be king, and it was all a steep learning curve for him. But what he did was he married Elizabeth of York, which then united the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. And this has been misrepresented in all sorts of ways, but essentially the facts are that it brought an end to the Wars of the Roses and everything.
So it was a sort of it was a tactical marriage, was it?
Well, all marriages were tactical at that level at the time.
Okay.
Very few people got married without thinking about the political and financial implications of it, particularly if you were the king. However, I'm convinced that they did love each other, and their son Arthur was going to be the new King Arthur. You see, and so that was all planned very well, and he had two daughters, Margaret and Mary, and another little son called Henry. And Henry was destined for the church because that's what you did if you weren't going to inherit. He would have been a famous bishop. And then what happened was that Henry VII formed a very strategic alliance with Spain, which meant that we ended up then with Catherine of Aragon coming across as Arthur's queen.
Yeah.
And then they both were struck down by a thing which certainly resonates with us now, called the sweating sickness, which took people regardless of any other consideration. It took the rich and the poor alike, and they broke into a fever, and the doctors at the time were completely at a loss what to do. And Catherine survived, only just, but of course Arthur died, and suddenly Henry is thrown into the line of succession as the future king. Once again, there's a theme here, is that each time they're not really at all well prepared for it. Yeah. And because of what had happened, Henry VII kept his son Henry in isolation. He almost locked him away. He forbid him from doing anything dangerous like jousting or going out with girls or whatever, just left him to his studies and almost under lock and key. And then, of course, when Henry VII fell ill and died, Henry VIII was suddenly not only king, but he was free to do all the things he'd been banned from doing.
Yeah. How old was he when he became king?
He was about, I think he was about 18. Yeah. I don't write about Henry VIII, by the way. I should say that I think enough has been said about Henry VIII. So what I do is I write about everybody around him.
Yes.
So that each of my books gives you another facet of him. A different perspective. So, for example, I've written about his sister Mary Tudor, he married her after the ailing King of France, King Louis of France, who died after a few months of the marriage. So we see Henry VIII through Mary's eyes rather than talking about him directly. And then Mary Tudor marries Charles Brandon, who is Henry VIII's best friend and has been since he was a boy. So we see Henry through the eyes of that friendship then. And that's the way I've continued to write ever since, because Catherine Willoughby, some historians have said that she could have been the seventh wife, because when Mary died, Charles Brandon married Catherine Willoughby, who was his ward, his 14-year-old ward, which was tricky to write about because I didn't want people reading it for the wrong reasons. But there was nothing unusual in that at the time. And so when Charles Brandon died, it would have been perfectly reasonable for Henry VIII to have taken an interest in it, except for one thing, that he was married to Catherine Parr, who was Catherine Willoughby's best friend.
Right.
So the way I've followed the story through is right from its inception with Owen Tudor's first meeting with Catherine of Valois, right through to the death of Elizabeth I. So where I am at the moment is I'm working my way around Elizabeth's court, looking at all of the key players in Elizabeth's court and how they perceived Elizabeth. So when I've finished the last book of my Elizabethan series, I will have a continuous thread. They all link together, you see. So I'll have a continuous thread which goes from Owen Tudor right through to the end of Elizabeth's reign. And it started almost by accident, but it works very well because the feedback from readers is that they enjoy the space that I've got to introduce somebody probably as a child in one book, and then when you follow their story in the next book, they're growing up and they eventually grow old and eventually die, of course, but it's spread over several books.
I think that having listened to your podcasts and extracts from the audiobooks, I think it's a great, somebody like me who obviously had a limited schooling, shall we say, of the period, it's a great way to actually learn a lot more about the period, but in a way that, you're reading a book, you're hearing about what people did, their feelings, everything else. I think it's a great way of learning more.
There's an interesting debate in the historical fiction world because some people like to do the alternative version. So they have a book about Richard III winning at Bosworth and things like that, which is fine. But my approach is to faithfully dig out the known facts. And that's sometimes almost an impossibility when I talk about known facts. I mean, I rely on primary sources as much as I can. A lot of those are written in medieval French and things like that. So I have to rely on translations. I can't even speak Latin myself, but I get it translated.
Yeah.
And of course, like I said, visiting the actual locations. But what you always end up with is two things. One is conflicting perspectives, where some people say that Margaret Beaufort was scheming and simply serving her own ends, and others say that she was quite the opposite. So I try to find a middle ground, which is the reasonable approach. But then you end up with gaps because there are always massive gaps in the historical record where you might have a letter that's written and then 10 years pass before the next surviving letter. And if I was a historian, I actually read it in the books. It says 10 years passed then, and as a reader, it makes you think, what on earth happened in that last 10 years?
And when you research the characters that sort of are in the novels, do you find that your opinion of them changes as you find out more about them? I mean, you presumably come to them with an opinion, and then once you've done research, does that change?
One of the most telling examples that I've just received back from my editor, my book, the first book of the Elizabethan series, which is about a chap called Francis Drake. And virtually everything that I thought I knew about him was wrong. So, like, he did actually play bowls, but he wasn't playing bowls when the Spanish Armada came into sight or anything like that. And he did trade in slaves, but he also freed slaves, and his best friend was a former slave who saved his life on more than one occasion. And I just really enjoy going beyond what most people know about a person and finding out that he was married twice, for example. The first time to a local girl from Plymouth. And then, of course, he became one of the richest men in the country. And after her days, he married a wealthy heiress. And neither marriages were great, but for the opposite reasons. And it was quite fun to explore that, because the difference between the local girl that could hardly understand why he would possibly be meeting the Queen of England, through to somebody that took that as completely for granted, but couldn't understand why he still wanted to spend time with the ordinary sailors,
Yeah.
And so in every case, in every book that I've written, particularly with Henry VII, I had this picture in my mind of a fairly miserly character, which is how most people understand him to be, when in fact he was wildly extravagant with his clothes and things like that. And he really enjoyed gambling and lost a fortune gambling at cards and things, which doesn't fit at all with the miserly view of him.
No. And have you ever, apart from one or two things that you've discovered about people, have you ever come across any facts where, because you've done the research, they're facts that you've found and nobody else has? Unique facts?
That's really interesting, because I following Henry Tudor on exile in Brittany, I realised then how thin the research has been about his time at the chateau in the forest, and that almost nothing really appears in the books about it. But when you go there, the local people have got a lot of documented evidence about his time there, and the fact that he met a local girl and lived with her for a while and things like that, which really doesn't appear in any of the biographies. So I find that intriguing.
Yeah.
And I'm not a historian, but I include all those sort of details in my books as legitimately verifiable as far as it's possible to do so.
Yes. Onto your books, the Tudor trilogies is the sort of one that you're known for. Where should people start at the first book, I guess, but have you done books before that?
Yes.
That people might give some background to it?
The very first book, I don't know whether you've heard of it, but there's a concept called agile project management, which was at the time a very fresh approach to project management, which was very much about how people might work in teams on a project very effectively.
Oh, in corporate in corporate world.
In corporate world,
yeah.
right?
Yeah,
I'll give the very short version that I was responsible for the pedestrianisation of a major street in Cardiff. And I wasn't the project manager of it, but the project manager of it suddenly fell ill, and I ended up picking up the pieces. And so I applied this, what was then, it had grown from the computer program development world, and it was one of the first times it had been used in local authorities for changing a cityscape. And I wrote a short ebook about it, which became an immediate bestseller in the US. And I was just absolutely bewildered by that. But that's the way it worked at the time. This is 10 years ago now.
Yeah.
So that inspired me then to have a go at historical fiction. So I wrote a book called Queen's Sacrifice, which the history of Wales was very much the kings of the north fighting the kings of the south, and the Saxon influence against the old the Druid religion around the Anglesey area. So I realised that I could take a famous chess game, which
I was going to say, Queen's Sacrifice is in chess, isn't it?
Yeah, the game of the century is a famous chess game. And what I did was I had the northern king as the black king, and the southern king as the white king. And then every single move in the game gave me the narrative of the book. So I faithfully followed the narrative. It was a very ambitious job at the time. So you ended up with things like in the game, a queen takes a pawn. So I had to come up with a plausible narrative where the white queen would take a black pawn, be responsible for his death, in other words.
Yeah.
And that's how I learnt about structuring a novel, because although that never made it to the bestseller lists, straight on the back of that I wrote Owen, book one of the Tudor Trilogy, which I'm pleased to say went straight to number one in the US and the UK and several other countries.
Wow.
and was fantastic. I mean, it's so much harder to do that these days because at the time there weren't 100,000 people uploading books to Amazon every day like there is now. So now
100,000
I
every
don't
day.
know how many now. There's hundreds of thousands
Yeah, yeah.
because it's so easy to do. It takes about 5 minutes to do. I've also been published by commercial publishers, and what I've found, I got 3 books, one of which is Queen Sacrifice, which are commercially published. But what I find is that I set up my own publishing company, Preseli Press. The view from my house is of the Preseli Hills.
Yeah.
And what that means is I get 70% royalties and I got complete control. So with commercial publishers, they basically tell you what the cover's going to look like, and all sorts of how it's going to be advertised, when it's released. Everything is up to the publisher. But as an independent publisher, everything is up to me. And the best thing is that, apart from getting 70% royalties, I really enjoy having complete control. So I've still kept those 3 books with the commercial publisher, but the Elizabethan series is all through Preseli Press. And that means that I can pop in and put updates in the back of the books at any time.
Right. Yeah.
And I also stumbled across 2 other things, which is that I could form partnerships with audiobook narrators where, in return for a profit share deal, I could have an audiobook made of any of my books at no cost. So all of my books are also, all of my Tudor books are also audiobooks.
And do you find that the audio, the actual production of an audiobook helps the sales of
Absolutely,
the digital? Yeah.
Some people have only got time to listen to an audiobook. Some people have got eyesight problems. There's all sorts of reasons why people like audiobooks. And some people listen to one of my audiobooks and then move on to buy all of the paper copies. So I really recently listened, one of my heroes is C.J. Sansom and the Shardlake series. I don't know if you've heard of that, but
I have heard of it. Yeah.
I'd been reading the books as hardback books, and I decided I'd try the next one as an audiobook, and I really struggled. It's 9 hours of listening. Yeah. I struggled to visualize it in the same way. So I'm somebody that very much prefers to have a paper book than an audiobook.
Yes. Yeah, I commuted for a long time to Coventry from where I live. So it's a good use of time. Yeah. Yes, it's a good use of time. I did Have you read Shantaram?
No.
No, it's a good one. But it's about 34 hours long. So I don't know how thick the book would be.
Well, I'll tell you something that's fascinating, though, is that there's an actress called Ruth Redman who narrates the books which are female characters. So I find it absolutely mind-boggling when I turn on my computer and she sends me the first copy for approval to hear my own characters talking.
Oh, really?
To hear their voices. Yeah. And I think, did I write that? Because she adds, a good narrator will add a whole nother dimension to the words with her intonation and her pauses and the way that she deals with the male characters is just a whole nother thing. The other thing I've been doing is having my books translated into foreign languages. So I've got translators working on the Tudor Trilogy. It's available in Spanish and Portuguese, and they're translating it into Italian and German. And that's quite fascinating because there's a whole nother world out there of people that didn't know anything about the Tudors, that are relying on my books as their primary source of information, I think, which is quite fascinating.
Do you get a lot of interest from America?
Biggest market. I don't know. Perhaps you can explain why, but my biggest readership is middle-aged American ladies. So several times I've done author chats with groups in America over Skype or FaceTime or whatever. And invariably, I've got a room full, they're all over America. To me, in my mind, they're in a room.
Yeah.
And my wife said they all sound the same. And I say to them, have you ever been to Windsor Castle? And they all laugh, because that's like saying, have you ever been to Mars? To some of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's quite interesting, that there's this massive market out there. But my books sell in 13 countries over Amazon. So I literally do have readers all over the globe. And I ran a book giveaway, and I was hoping, because I have to post the books to the winners, I was hoping that they were both going to be in Wales, would be good, but the UK would be helpful. One was in Alaska, and I looked it up, and it was in the most remote backwoods of Alaska, and the other one was in the Australian bush. So,
both, one extreme to the other.
Yeah, both books have reached the winners, but I just find that intriguing, that the world is a shrinking place, and particularly so now.
Yeah. The latest book was Katherine, Tudor Duchess, and that came out last year, was it?
Yes, and that's way exceeded my expectations, because it was a little bit of a gamble, because I'd hardly heard of Catherine Willoughby, and I wondered whether people would be really interested in her story. But it's such an intriguing story, because she's the wealthiest heiress in the country, and then she becomes the ward of this best friend of Henry VIII, Charles Brandon, who most people know from the television with his portrayal in various things. But the real Charles Brandon is quite a fascinating character. And then Mary Tudor, this is the Catholic Mary Tudor, comes to the throne, and all of a sudden Catherine's life, she could be thrown in the tower, because she was a Protestant, and so she flees the country with her small child, and has to live in exile. And that whole story is just fascinating, because
I bet it is. Yeah.
She was named after Catherine of Aragon, by the way, because her mother was Maria de Salinas, who was Catherine of Aragon's 15-year-old companion who came with her from Spain.
Oh, right.
So, and then Maria de Salinas married Willoughby, who was one of the nobles of Henry's court, and they got given Grimsthorpe Castle as a wedding present. So that's the whole story is quite fascinating. But there's so many little things, like how Catherine might have felt about being suddenly finding herself Duchess of Suffolk and married to a man who was nearly old enough to be her grandfather, And when I visited Grimsthorpe, in the corridor outside Catherine's room, there are two portraits on the wall, one of Charles Brandon and one of Catherine. And the age difference is quite stark. It really brings it into focus. There's this old man with a white beard, and then there's this really quite young woman at the side of him. And you realise then it must have been quite a challenge but she had no say in it, of course. No,
and that went on quite a lot, didn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in terms of next books, what have you got coming up, Tony?
I'm working my way around the Tudor court, and I keep changing my mind of Elizabeth I, by the way. I keep changing my mind about the order of who it's going to be, because I had some people that I definitely wanted to cover, and Drake was one of the first, but also Walter Raleigh is a fascinating character, and I've spent a couple of years researching both of them, and then when I was writing Drake, this guy, the Essex, Robert Devereux, comes galloping down to Plymouth and steals one of Drake's ships and sails off to Cadiz. And I thought, what the heck is going on here,
Yeah.
And it turns out that Robert Devereux, who's the Queen's favourite, and he's his stepfather is Robert Dudley.
Yeah.
He'd asked the Queen whether he could sail with Drake, and she'd said, absolutely not. don't even dare think about it. So his response was to jump on a horse and charge to Plymouth and steal a ship. And I was just so intrigued by this. I started looking into his story, and that's the book that I'm writing now, which is the second book in the series. And of course, it overlaps with Drake, but it also has people in it like William Cecil, who was a best friend of Catherine Willoughby as a younger man and could have married her if he wasn't already married. Yeah. He is now an old man who is effectively Devereux's sponsor after his father died in Ireland. And there's this sort of thread that runs like a golden thread that runs through the whole thing, where each book is linked to at least one or more other books. Yes. And I quite enjoy that because it means that I've got a depth of knowledge about these people going back to when they were children, which most people wouldn't have, I suppose. And the research that I do, I've got obviously a wealth of biographies and history books and stuff like that. But the research that I've been doing about Elizabethan London, for example, is going to apply in all of the books in different ways. So that works very well for me. Yeah.
Yeah, you've got that sort of bank of subject matter.
Absolutely. But I try to come at it fresh. So I recently did a series of podcasts about the wives of Henry VIII, and I decided to approach each one from a research point of view completely fresh, and to set aside everything I knew about each of the wives and to look at them from a new perspective, particularly from their letters and anything like that. So that was quite interesting to do as an exercise.
So in terms of Henry VIII and his wives, with the research you did, who do you think was his favourite?
Oh, that's a good question. At different times, each of them was, because as a little boy, he was in awe of Catherine of Aragon, and the idea that he could marry her appealed to him. So he was very proud to marry Catherine of Aragon. People give the impression that they weren't married for very long, but they were married for 17 years or something like that.
Oh, right.
And so it's a long time that he was with her. So I think he would have always had a special place for her. But personally, I think the answer to your question is Catherine Parr. She's kind of dismissed as that she just nursed him in his old age, but there was much more to it than that. And they shared a lot of interests, and what wasn't there? There wasn't the burden of having to produce an heir, which had always been there with the other wives. Yeah, and I find it hard to believe that he really felt the same about somebody like Catherine Howard. Yeah, because it was quite a short-lived business, and even Anne Boleyn. So much has been said and written about Anne Boleyn, but in some ways, they were almost too alike because they clashed quite often, really. Yeah. And so the whole thing is quite intriguing. And I find it fascinating to see Henry through their eyes. Do you see what I mean?
I do, yeah.
How, for example, Catherine Parr, I really enjoyed writing the scene in my last published book, which was Catherine, Tudor Duchess, where for the first time she finds herself alone with Henry VIII. How that might have gone, where he dismisses all the courtiers and they're just suddenly alone together in his chambers. Yeah, that was quite fun to write, quite honestly.
I bet it was. Yeah,
and I've actually been in those, obviously, wherever it's possible to visit. I've been in the actual rooms where we can, so I got a good feel for what it was like, and so that's all reflected in the books as well.
I guess when you do this research and you go to the various places around the country and around Europe or whatever, It's almost like a mini holiday at the same time.
Absolutely. And it's all chargeable as expenses as well, which is one of the benefits of being a full-time author.
Yeah. And just on the subject of being an author, I know many listeners, I know I certainly have, but a lot of people have always had this ambition to write a book, but many of us never get round to it. What would you say to those people?
I'd say there's never been a better time to do it. And the reason is that when I started out, I happened to be quite skilled at writing code. And so I could code an ebook in HTML. And that means so that there was an index and all the headings were right. And if there was any pictures, they were in the right places. It used to take me months to do. And now there's software called Vellum, where you import a Word document, click on Produce ebook, and you can view it on a Kindle device within 5 minutes. And wow. I still find that like some kind of magic trick, you know?
Yeah.
And it does such a lovely job of it as well. And it also produces a print-ready version as a PDF, which you can just upload to Amazon. So what I say to people is to consider what I do, which is that I set myself a target of writing 500 words a day, every day. And
365 days a year.
Yeah. And wow. It becomes a habit, like anything else. I mean, that's how I make my living, but it does become a habit that I tend to wake early with my head buzzing with ideas and quickly write them down and find I've already got 300 words down, you know. Yeah. And then I might spend the rest of the day researching and write the other 200. Sometimes I write 1,500 words in a day, and but I still carry on because what I normally try and write is 25 chapters, roughly, of about 4,000 words each to arrive at 100,000 words for editing, and then that normally gets edited down to 80 or 90,000 words.
Yes,
because it's surprising how many words an editor will happily cut out.
Yeah,
I do recommend getting a professional editor because that additional viewpoint on your work makes all the difference, I think. They spot things that as an author you might never spot because you're too close to it.
So are you in touch with your editor as you're writing, or no, do you speak to them? It's at the end of the process.
The process is that I normally, this year's been unusual because I've been writing during lockdown, but normally what I do is I sail and go out on motorbikes and stuff in the summer, and then I start writing in the autumn. Once the boat's in the boatyard, I start writing, and then I try to get the book off to my editor by June, and then the cycle starts again, and I publish before Christmas normally. And that's worked well. So this year I'm going to end up having written 2 books thanks to the lockdown, because it seemed to be the best way to use the time, really.
Yeah. And do you, obviously you do the research, but do you plan the book totally beforehand? Or does it develop as you travel?
No, I don't think you could. I think you'd have to leave a bit of space. So some chapters have just got a 1-sentence description, like a memorable one in Drake is the Spanish Armada is sighted. And that's a whole chapter. And basically what I then have to do is immerse myself in what really happened when the Spanish Armada was sighted. And I learned so much that I didn't know that we had a handful of men on the Isle of Wight pretending to make it look well defended. And the Spanish Armada believed us. And it's a bit like the Battle of Britain. You know, the Germans thought we had much more planes than we really did. And we were kind of putting on a brave front. And so they didn't take the Isle of Wight. If they'd have taken the Isle of Wight, we could all be speaking Spanish now.
Yeah, I never knew that about the Isle of Wight.
No, these are the sort of things that I just discovered. And that Drake obviously did know the truth and believed that we were all done for because the Isle of Wight would be occupied by the Spanish and would become their base. And from there, they'd be able to launch attacks on Southampton and Portsmouth and even Plymouth whenever they wanted to. I also didn't realise that Drake led an English armada against the Spanish. I wasn't taught that at school.
No.
And so, he went happily sailing off to get our own back into Cadiz, and the whole fleet was there being repaired after what got back after the Armada, because I was also given the impression that almost no ships made it back to Spain, which isn't true at all. Yeah. And he happily set about burning and sinking all the ships in Cadiz whilst being bombarded by the shore battery. So it's just it'd make a fantastic film, I think. Yeah, so any screenwriters there listening, that would be spectacular, wouldn't it?
It would be. And that was one of the questions I was going to ask, actually, Tony, was have you, you're obviously doing the audio books, but have you, are there any plans to televise or film?
Oh, do you know, it's such a shame. I have to be careful what I say, but this company called Stars basically did a sort of fairly low budget version of the stories, and they did some outrageous things, like they merged Mary, Tudor Queen of France, with her sister Margaret. Surely, I still can't understand. Could they not get two actresses, So they merged them. So anybody watching that's trying to learn would get hopelessly confused because they had such different lives. One became Queen of France, one became Queen of Scotland. And to merge them is outrageous. So quite often I end up shouting at the telly and turning it off. But even the famous series, The Tudors, was so full of compromises that they'd done for television effect. You know what I mean? So Charles Brandon is completely rewritten as a completely different kind of person. Yeah. And the religious dimension almost disappears completely when it was such a big deal. Yeah. So I think to try and get the story put right would be a fantastic thing to do. But I know what any production companies would say, particularly in the current climate, is that it's kind of been done. We need something fresh.
But your books obviously have a lot of fresh stuff in them that haven't been told.
Yeah, that's right. And
so, like you say, if anybody's listening, read Tony's books.
And they are, each is written to be standalone. So lots of people have told me that they've started off with Henry's story, for example, and then worked backwards and found it worked perfectly well because they quite liked knowing what was going to happen, Yeah. I would say the best way is to start off at the beginning of the story where Owen Tudor first meets Catherine of Valois. Otherwise, it's quite hard to understand why Henry VIII turned out quite as he did. Yeah. But once you know that he was never supposed to be king and that he was destined for a life in the church and that he was locked away and not allowed to even joust, but Charles Brandon used to sneakily give him some jousting lessons, that gives you a different view of his life, doesn't it?
Yeah, and his character. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. So you've got your novels. You've got your website, which also incorporates a blog, but also where you actually interview other writers, I noticed.
Yeah, what I've got my website, which is tonyriches.com, but I've also got a blog called The Writing Desk. And I quite enjoy that because that's where I write about my research visits. So the whole of my following in the footsteps of the Tudors to Brittany and back was spread over several months' worth of blog posts. I think there's a dozen or so of them. But also I've enjoyed doing specific blog posts about other writers. So the writers' habits, I've got a whole series of those. So that's been quite fun. Like Thomas Hardy, I went and visited Thomas Hardy's cottage and his house and everything.
He's one of my favourite authors too.
Well, and mine. There you are, we share that. Have you been to his cottage?
I haven't.
I recommend it. It's National Trust and it's just fantastic. Yeah. But in his bedroom, there's an authentic rug by the side of his bed, which is, of his time, the sort of rug that he would have put his feet on when he got out of bed, and that was made by my mum. So that's my.
Oh, really?
That's my contact with. No, she lives in Dorset, not far from Hardy's Cottage. You see.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
But
and so, what's downtime for you when you're not writing?
Well, normally I love to go sailing. So we've, thanks to Owen, we've got a beautiful yacht on the river Cleddau, and we went down to see it yesterday. It's in the boatyard and started up the engine. It's quite sad, really, that this is the first time that I can remember that we've not been sailing.
Yeah.
Got a smaller boat on the drive, which we're hoping to go out in next week. And also, I used to do a lot of kayaking because in Pembrokeshire we've got hundreds of miles of really nice coastline for kayaking around, as well as the river.
Yeah.
And
is that two-person kayaking or single?
I've got a sea kayak, and my wife's got a sit-on kayak, so she likes the idea of it being unsinkable. But I also like motorbikes, so we live 20 minutes from Tenby, so the other day we popped down to Tenby on the motorbike, which is a nice little trip, and so that's what I would normally be doing this time of year, not writing. And as I've already said, I would have been down in Plymouth visiting all Drake's places now. Instead of that, I've had to do it using Google Earth and things like that.
Yeah, not quite the same.
Not the same at all.
But still helpful.
But interestingly, you can actually go to the chapel where Drake got married, and it's still there, and you can stand on the very spot. And things like that, I just find are so compelling.
Fantastic.
Because you just feel that you literally are standing in their footsteps then. Yeah.
So where can people find out more about your work, Tony? And where can they get your books?
Yeah, if you just Google Tony Riches, that sounds a bit of a claim. But if you Google Tony Riches, it should come up. Apart from the ones which are commercially published, all the Tudor books are exclusive to Amazon. And that's a partnership because Amazon promote them for me, so I don't have to do so much promotional work then. Yeah. That's the benefit of exclusivity. There's obviously a downside, but that's the benefit of it.
Yeah. And we'll put all that on the show notes.
Yeah, and everything is on my website, which is www.tonyriches.com, and including my email. So I enjoy hearing from readers. They ask me, sometimes they surprise me. Somebody in America told me that their son was relying on my books for all of his history classes and was doing very well out of it. He's doing very well out of it. So that's, suddenly I find I've got this new responsibility to be factually correct with everything.
Yeah. Well, Tony, thanks ever so much for coming on. This has been a fantastic conversation, and thank you for being a guest.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. My thanks go to today's guest, Tony Riches, best-selling author and specialist in the history of the early Tudors. I found this conversation with Tony fascinating. It was interesting to discover how much research and fact-finding he undertakes. So I think that his books, as well as providing a great read, also give an opportunity to learn more about the Tudor period. You have been listening to Undercurrent Stories. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to share the show link to your friends and family, and if you have 60 seconds, I would be most grateful if you would please rate and review. To hear more episodes, please subscribe to the show and visit undercurrentstories.com. If you leave your email in the link, we will notify you as soon as new episodes are released. Also, check out our social media links, details of which can be found on the show notes. Until next time, this is Bob Wells wishing you all the very best.